Welcome. I'm Sean O'Connor. I'm a classical and electric guitarist and full-time music teacher. I'm also the director of the Sacramento Community Guitar Orchestra, which is a program of the Sacramento Guitar Society. If you'd like to learn more about me, the Guitar Society, and the Guitar Orchestra, visit the website links in the video description. Now, in this video series, I'm going to teach you how to play, write, and understand chord progressions. This is an incredibly useful skill for any musician because once you can do it, you're going to easily be able to write good sounding sequences of chords, which can form the basis or the bedrock of a musical composition. You can use it for songwriting, you can use it for classical composition, you can use it for jamming with people, you can use it to recognize sequences of chords that people are playing and analyze them on the fly, and perhaps even create a guitar solo, if you know a few other things. Even if you're not interested in writing, understanding how chord progressions work is going to give you great insight into the music that you're playing and help you learn it faster. Along the way, you're also going to learn how to play 36 different chords, 3 different ways each, for a total of 108 chord voicings. Don't worry, it's easier than it sounds. The first step before we can really get into progressions is understanding what chords really are and where they come from. In this video, I'm going to show you how to build basic 3-note chords, or triads, from scales, and then figure out what kind of chords you just built. Before we even do that, though, I'm going to explain why most guitar players don't know enough about chords and why it's useful to learn more. Most guitar players who play casually don't know very much about chords, which is pretty ironic, since playing chords is about 90% of what we do. If I say, play a G major chord, most guitar players would do this. Cowboy chord. Well, guess what? This is a G major chord as well. And this. And this. And this. I could go on. Chords are more than just shapes. And that's why most pop players approach them the wrong way, because they don't read notes, nor do they even know the notes of the fingerboard, generally speaking. All they can do is read chord grids and tablature. If you only see shapes, you're only seeing part of the picture, because a G major chord is really just a combination of 3 notes, G, B, and D. And no matter where you play those on the guitar, on the fingerboard, you're playing a G major chord. We're going to talk more about that later, but now it's time for me to bring classical players to task as well. So, most classical players, including some very serious ones, don't know nearly enough about chords either, but for a different reason. They only read notes. A typical classical guitarist could read all those G major chords I played earlier if they had the sheet music in front of them, but could not play them from memory or figure them out on the fly. This is a problem. See, the pop players have one part of the picture and the classical players have the other part of the picture, and too often don't see the whole picture. So, we're going to talk about the whole picture in a minute. First, I'm going to tell you how the material in this video and the others in the series will help you to be a better player. Here are a few reasons. Number 1, you'll be able to recognize what chords you're playing and name them. Having a name for something makes it easier to remember. Number 2, you'll be able to play chords all over the fretboard, making you more flexible and versatile, especially when playing with others. Number 3, if somebody wants you to play a G major chord, you can smugly ask them which one. Number 4, you're going to become more familiar with the upper range of the fretboard. And finally, number 5, which really is the only reason you ought to need, you're going to become a better educated, better rounded musician. So let's get started. The first step is to learn how chords and scales are related. For now, we are going to use the simplest, most commonly used scale, C major. Here are its notes: C, D, E, F, G, A, and B. Now we're going to number those notes from 1 to 7, where C is 1, D is 2, E is 3, and so on. The next step is to build some chords using only the notes of this scale. Now, the simplest type of chord is a triad. Triads have three notes: a root, which is the note that gives the chord its name, a third, which is the third note up from the root, and the fifth, which is the fifth note up from the root. The easiest way to remember this is 1, 3, 5. Here's an example. If you want to build a triad on the note C, begin by simply declaring that C is the root of the chord. That's note 1 of our C major scale. To get the third, you simply go to note 3, which is E. To get the fifth, go to note 5, which is G. So, we just learned that if we build a triad starting on the first note of the C major scale, we get a chord whose notes are C, E, and G. We know it's some kind of C chord, but we don't yet know if it's major, minor, or something else. More on that later, but first, let's get the rest of the triads from this scale spelled out. Not just C, but each and every note of the C major scale can be the root of a new triad. That means that in addition to C, we can also build chords on D, E, F, G, A, and B, giving us 7 triads in all. The next chord we're going to spell is from the D note of the C major scale. So that's going to be our root. Next we have to go up to the third note from D, which is F. From there we go up to the fifth note from D, which is A, and that also happens to be the third note from F. Our D chord then is going to be spelled D, F, and A, which is notes 2, 4, and 6 of the C major scale. Now, don't be confused by this. It still follows the pattern of 1, 3, and 5. We're just treating D as if it's the 1. But if we look at it in terms of which note of the scale we're playing, then it is in fact notes 2, 4, and 6. To get our third triad from the C major scale, we're going to make E the root note. From E, the third note is G, and the fifth note is B. Therefore, our E chord is spelled E, G, and B, which is notes 3, 5, and 7 of the C major scale. With the next chord, F, we run into a problem. We start on F, which is note 4 of the scale. Then we go up to A, which is note 6 of the scale, to get the third. But where do we go from there if the C scale has only 7 notes? The answer is simple. We just have to roll up to the next octave. So, note 1 is C, note 2 is D, note 3 is E, 4 is F, 5 is G, 6 is A, 7 is B, and then it just goes back to C. So we're back on note 1, just an octave higher, note 2 is D, note 3 is E, note 4 is F, and so on. So you just continue the scale, but in the next octave. Once we can envision that C scale going up through multiple octaves, it's pretty easy to see what's next in terms of spelling out our F major triad, because now we can see that the fifth note from F is C, which is actually note 1, or if you want, note 8 of the C major scale. So that gives us the complete spelling of our F major chord. Actually, we don't know it's major yet, more on that later. Our F triad, which is spelled F, A, and C, which is notes 4, 6, and 1, or 8, of the C major scale. To get the rest of the triads from the C major scale, we simply continue to follow the same pattern, starting on each of the remaining root notes. For the G triad, we get notes G, B, and D, which are the 5th, 7th, and 2nd notes of the C major scale. For the A triad, we get the notes A, C, and E, which are notes 6, 1, and 3. And then finally for the B triad, we get the notes B, D, and F, which are notes 7, 2, and 4 of the C major scale. At this point, we now have all 7 triads from the C major scale spelled out, one for each root note, and here they are. Remember earlier when I said we'd figure out what kinds of chords we had just spelled out? Now's the time. So in order to do this, we're going to have to start by looking at the whole steps and the half steps within the C major scale. If you don't know, a whole step is a distance between two notes on one string, 2 frets apart. So for example, if I play the first fret on the B string, which is a C, and then I go up to the 3rd fret on the same string, which is a D, because there's an empty fret in between those two notes, we would refer to that interval as a whole step. And it doesn't matter where you do that on the guitar. If you have two notes that are 2 frets apart, it's always a whole step. Anywhere you like, as long as you follow that simple rule, wherever. So those are all whole steps. So remember, it has to be on the same string, and it has to be 2 frets apart, 2 notes, 2 frets apart. So now that we know what a whole step is, it's actually going to be pretty simple to figure out what a half step is, because you just take a whole step and you cut it in half. And so now we're talking about 2 notes that are only 1 fret apart. So there's no empty fret in between these 2 notes. I'm playing the 5th fret on the A high E string, the 5th fret on the high E string, and there's a half step up to the 6th fret. This is an A, this is a B flat. So that's a half step. And again, it doesn't matter where I do that. Those are all half steps. Everywhere. So now that you understand whole steps and half steps, we are going to do a C major scale on one string so that you can see where the whole steps and half steps are within that scale. So let's go over it. I'm going to start on C on the 1st fret of the B string. Now we know the next note is D because we talked about that earlier. Now D is a whole step from C, so that's going to take us to the 3rd fret. C to D is a whole step. Now I'm on D, and if I want to get to E, I actually have to go another whole step, D to E. From E, here on the 5th fret, F is actually only a half step away, so that's different. E to F is a half step. Now from F to G, the next note of the scale, is another whole step, so that's 2 frets up to the 8th fret. Now G to A, the next note of the scale, that's also a whole step. A, the 10th fret here, to B is a whole step. And finally, to close out the scale, B, 12th fret, to C, 13th fret, that's also a half step. So the major scale, the C major scale, and actually all major scales have this pattern of whole steps and half steps, which actually make them sound like major scales. That's what creates the sound of the major scale, is the pattern of whole steps and half steps. And that pattern is whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step. Whole, whole, half. Whole, 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 half. Now, that's mostly whole steps. Where are the half steps? Well, they're between E and F and B and C. Or if you like, change the order a little bit, B, C, E, F. I like to use a memory trick with my students for remembering what notes are half steps, and that is bring cake every Friday. So B, C, E, F, bring cake every Friday. If you remember that, you can remember that all of the other steps, as long as you're not talking about sharps or flats, are going to be whole steps every time. Now that you know about whole steps and half steps, we can look at the intervals in between the notes of the triads that we discovered earlier, starting with the C triad. Now, if we look at the interval from C to E, that is the root to the 3rd of the C triad, we see that from C to D is a whole step, from D to E is also a whole step. So the interval from C to E is one of 2 whole steps. Next, let's look at the interval between the 3rd of the triad, E, and the 5th of the triad, which is G. Now, E to F is a half step, and F to G is a whole step. So if we're looking at the interval from E to G, we need to say that it's 1.5 steps, clearly different from the interval from C to E. So from C to E is 2 whole steps, and from E to G is 1.5 steps. Now let's do the same thing for the triad that we learned how to spell from D. The D triad had the notes D, F, and A in it. Now from D to F, we have D to E, which is a whole step, and then from E to F is a half step. So the interval from D to F, the root and the third of the D triad, is 1.5 steps. Then if we look at the interval from F to A, the third to the fifth, F to G is a whole step, and G to A is a whole step. So if we're talking about from F to A, then we're talking about 2 whole steps. So for the D triad, our intervals are from D to F, 1.5 steps, and from F to A, 2 whole steps. So clearly these chords are different because they have different intervals between the root and the third, and different intervals between the third and the fifth. The C triad, when we're talking about the interval from the root to the third, has an interval of 2 whole steps, whereas the D triad from D to F, the root to the third of the D triad, was 1.5 steps. And then if you're looking at 3 to 5, the C triad had 1.5 steps, and the D triad had an interval of 2 whole steps. So these chords are clearly different, and this is where we come to talk about major chords and minor chords. All major triads have that same structure that we discovered on the C triad. The C triad is in fact a C major chord or triad. So all major chords have an interval between the root and the third of 2 whole steps, and between the third and the fifth of 1.5 steps. Now the D triad is your basic minor triad. All minor triads have the same intervals as that D triad does, which is to say from the root to the third there will be 1.5 steps, and from the third to the fifth there will be 2 whole steps. So now that we know that, we can go through the rest of the triads of the C major scale, see what intervals they have, and define them as being either major or minor. So if we look at the intervals of the E triad, we're going to come to see that it's an E minor chord, because from E to G is 1.5 steps, and from G to B is 2 full steps. Next up we come to the F triad, which if we look at the intervals again, we see that from F to A is 2 whole steps, and from A to C is 1.5 steps. So that's a major triad. Next we do the G triad, G, B, and D. Now from G to B is 2 whole steps, and from B to D is 1.5 steps. So again, we see that the G triad is major. Next up we have the A triad, spelled A-C-E. From A to C is 1.5 steps, and from C to E is 2 whole steps. So we can clearly see that that triad is in fact a minor chord. Minor triad, minor chord. You can say it either way. Now when we come to the B triad, we're going to see something different, because the B triad is B-D-F. Now from B to D, that is 1.5 steps, because B to C is a half step and C to D is a whole step. From D to F, D to E is a whole step, and E to F is a half step. So from D to F is also 1.5 steps. So both of the intervals in this chord, both the one from the root to the third and the third to the fifth, both of those intervals are 1.5 step intervals. So this is neither major nor minor. It doesn't fit the definition of either of the other 2 triad types that we defined earlier. So what is this chord? Well, this is a third type of triad, and this is called a diminished triad, which is actually, it's sort of easy to remember because diminished means made smaller, and if you look at the intervals of that chord, both of them are of the smaller type of the 2 we discussed earlier. So that's the last triad of the C major scale, giving us all the triads of the C major scale, which are C major, D minor, E minor, F major, G major, A minor, and finally B diminished. Now we've talked about three types of triads. They've naturally happened in the C major scale, the chords that it generated. There is a fourth type that I just briefly want to address, and that is the augmented triad. Now, this didn't happen naturally in the major scale. It doesn't happen either in the natural minor scale, but there are some scales where you will see augmented triads pop up from time to time. So what is an augmented triad? Well, if diminished is made smaller, augmented is made bigger. Basically what we would see, for an example, let's say on a C augmented triad. A C augmented triad would be spelled C, E, G sharp. Now sharp means move up by a half step. So from C to E we have the interval of 2 whole steps. And from E to G sharp, because we moved that G up a half step, E to G sharp is going to be 2 full steps. So the augmented triad has 2 intervals of 2 whole steps, again between the root and the third, and the third and the fifth. So now that's all 4 types of triads. Major is between the root and the third, 2 whole steps, and between the third and the fifth, 1.5 steps. Minor, between the root and the third we have 1.5 steps. Between the third and the fifth we have 2 full steps. Diminished, between the 1 and the 3, or the root and the third, we have 1.5 steps. Between the third and the fifth we also have 1.5 steps. That's diminished. And the fourth, much rarer type of triad, the augmented triad, in between the root and the third you will have 2 full steps, and in between the third and the fifth you will have 2 full steps as well. Next up, we'll sum up everything you've learned in this video and briefly talk about what you might see in the next. Alright, so what did you learn in this video? Hopefully a lot, but I'm going to sum up everything we talked about. We looked at the C major scale, and we numbered its notes from 1 to 7. Then we defined the most basic type of chord, the triad, that is created by starting with a root and then adding the note 2 letters up, which is called the third, followed by the note 4 letters up from the root, or 2 letters up from the third, which is called the fifth. Then we proceeded to spell out all the triads in the key of C major, or from the C major scale, 1 for each note, following the 1-3-5 pattern each time. Next, we looked at the musical intervals of whole and half steps and learned how the C major scale is made up of a pattern of whole and half steps: whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. After that, we were able to examine the intervals in the triads that we had spelled earlier and discovered the different interval patterns for the 4 types of triads: major, minor, diminished, and augmented. And in so doing, also learned that the chords in the key of C major are C major, D minor, E minor, F major, G major, A minor, and B diminished. So that's a lot. And as far as being able to do this on your guitar, right now we don't have a lot, which is why in the next video I will show you 3 easy ways to play each of these chords on your guitar. 3 different ways, not just the cowboy chords. So stay tuned for that, probably next month. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.